It was supposed to be an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day that slips by unnoticed in the blur of high school routine. The sky outside was a dull, overcast gray, and the hallways buzzed with the low energy that always came before a long weekend. Our regular English teacher was out sick, so we had a substitute, a woman named Mrs. Carter, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She handed out a worksheet, told us to work quietly, and then sat at the desk, scrolling through her phone. I remember glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until the bell. My friend Tyler was doodling in his notebook, and the only sound in the room was the hum of the old radiator. That's when the intercom crackled to life, and the principal's voice came through, sharper than usual. "This is not a drill. Teachers, initiate lockdown procedures immediately." For a split second, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Carter's face went pale. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor, and she rushed to turn off the lights. The blinds were already drawn, but she motioned for us to get down, away from the windows. We all slid off our chairs and huddled against the wall, hearts pounding, eyes wide. The silence was suffocating. Someone whispered, "What's happening?" But nobody answered. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. The hallway outside was eerily quiet. No footsteps, no voices. Just the distant sound of a door slamming somewhere far away. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Time felt strange. Then, from the hallway, came the unmistakable sound of heavy boots on the linoleum. They stopped right outside our door. I could see the shadow of someone standing there, just beyond the thin strip of light under the door. Mrs. Carter held a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with fear. The handle rattled once, twice, as if someone was testing it. Then came a low, guttural voice, muffled but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "I know you're in there." Someone in our group whimpered. The boots moved on, fading down the hallway, but the fear lingered, thick and heavy. We stayed pressed against the wall, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the all clear was finally given. The principal's voice, shaky but calm, told us it was safe to come out. We filed out of the classroom, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light. In the hallway, police officers stood guard, their faces grim. Later, we learned that a man had entered the school through a side door left propped open for deliveries. He'd wandered the halls, trying doors, until the police arrived and apprehended him near the gym. He was unarmed, but the fear he left behind was real, and it lingered long after the lockdown ended. For weeks, I couldn't walk past that classroom without remembering the shadow under the door, the sound of those boots, and the way Mrs. Carter's hands shook as she tried to keep us calm. It was her last day as a substitute. She never came back. The second story happened in middle school, during the last period of the day. It was raining hard outside, the kind of rain that made the windows rattle and turned the playground into a muddy mess. Our science teacher, Mr. Patel, was explaining something about chemical reactions, but nobody was really paying attention. Everyone was restless, eager to go home. Suddenly, the fire alarm blared, loud and shrill. We all jumped, expecting the usual drill. But instead of lining up, Mr. Patel's face went serious. He told us to stay put, to get away from the windows. The intercom came on, and the vice principal's voice was tense. "Lockdown. This is not a drill. Teachers, secure your classrooms." Mr. Patel locked the door and turned off the lights. We crouched behind the lab tables, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. The rain outside seemed to get louder, drumming against the glass. That's when I noticed her, the girl in the red hoodie. She was new, had only joined our class a week before. She sat by herself, always quiet, always watching. Now, she was staring at the door, her hands clenched into fists. A few minutes later, footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were fast, frantic, like someone running. The door handle rattled, and someone banged on the door hard. "Let me in. Please let me in." It was a girl's voice, high-pitched and desperate. Mr. Patel hesitated, torn between helping and following the lockdown rules. The girl in the red hoodie stood up, her face pale. "That's my sister," she whispered. But Mr. Patel shook his head, motioning for her to sit down. The banging continued, growing more frantic, then suddenly stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of the rain. After what felt like forever, the all-clear was given. We opened the door to find the hallway empty, except for a single red backpack lying on the floor. The girl in the red hoodie picked it up, her hands trembling. Later, we learned that a student had panicked during the lockdown and tried to get back to her classroom, but the doors were locked. She was found safe in the office, but the fear in her sister's eyes never really went away. My high school was old old, that the basement still had the original brick walls and creaky wooden doors from when the building was first constructed. Most students avoided the basement unless they had to go there for storage or to help a teacher. But for me, it was a daily routine. I was part of the tech crew, and our little office was tucked away in a corner of the basement, surrounded by stacks of unused textbooks and broken projectors. It was a Friday afternoon, and the school was buzzing with the usual end-of-week energy. I was alone in the basement, finishing up some inventory work, when my phone buzzed with a text from my friend Mark. "Dude, lockdown. Stay put." At first, I thought he was joking, but then the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the basement into near darkness. The only light came from the small window high up on the wall, barely illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. My heart started to race. I remembered the lockdown drills we practiced, but being alone in the basement made everything feel different, more real, more dangerous. I quickly turned off my phone's flashlight and crouched behind a stack of boxes, trying to make myself invisible. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps echoing from the floor above. I tried to steady my breathing, but every little noise seemed amplified in the darkness. Then, I heard a slow, deliberate creak from the far end of the basement. It was the door to the old boiler room, a place nobody ever went unless they had to. The door opened with a groan, and I could just make out a shadow moving inside. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a teacher, a janitor, or someone who wasn't supposed to be there at all? The shadow moved closer, and I pressed myself tighter against the boxes, barely daring to breathe. I could hear the faint sound of someone muttering under their breath, words I couldn't quite make out. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to clench them into fists to keep quiet. Suddenly, the shadow stopped. I could see the outline of a man, tall and thin, standing just a few feet away. He seemed to be searching for something, his head turning slowly from side to side. I remembered the stories I'd heard about break-ins at other schools, about people hiding in basements during lockdowns. My mind conjured up every horror story I'd ever heard, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The man took a step closer, and I could see his face in the dim light, pale, gaunt, with wild eyes that darted around the room. He looked right at me, or at least I thought he did. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked back toward the boiler room. The door creaked shut behind him, and the basement was silent once more. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. Eventually, the lights flickered back on, and my phone buzzed again, this time with the all-clear message. I waited a few more minutes before creeping out from behind the boxes and making my way upstairs. When I told the principal what had happened, he looked concerned but skeptical. They searched the basement, but found nothing, no sign of the man, no evidence that anyone had been there. For weeks after, I avoided the basement whenever I could, but sometimes, late in the afternoon, I'd hear that same creak from the boiler room, and I'd remember the wild eyes staring out from the shadows. After those lockdowns, school never felt quite the same. The hallways seemed darker, the classrooms colder. Every time the intercom crackled, my heart would skip a beat. Even the teachers seemed more on edge, glancing nervously at the doors during class. Rumors spread quickly. Stories about the man in the basement, about the girl in the red hoodie, about the substitute who never came back. Some students laughed it off, making jokes to hide their fear. Others grew quiet, sticking close to their friends and avoiding empty hallways. The administration tried to reassure us. They installed new security cameras, hired more guards, and held assemblies about safety and vigilance. But the sense of safety we'd once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety that never really went away. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way the janitor always checked the doors twice, the way teachers kept their phones close at hand, the way students jumped at sudden noises, even the smallest things. A locker slamming, a loud voice in the hallway could send a ripple of fear through the building. At home, my parents tried to comfort me, telling me that these things were rare, that I was safe, but I could see the worry in their eyes, the way they hugged me a little tighter before I left for school each morning. It's strange how quickly fear can become a part of your daily life. For weeks after the lockdowns, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the corners of my room, heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that someone was standing just outside my window. At school, I found myself scanning the faces of strangers, looking for anything out of place. I memorized the locations of every exit, every hiding spot. I kept my phone charged, just in case. Even my friends, who used to joke about everything, grew quieter, more serious. We all carried the experience with us. Even if we didn't talk about it, it became a kind of unspoken bond, a shared memory that connected us in ways we couldn't explain. Sometimes, late at night, I'd text Tyler or Mark, just to make sure they were okay. We never talked about what happened, but we didn't have to. We all knew. As the weeks turned into months, life at school slowly began to resemble what it had been before. The laughter in the hallways returned, and the nervous glances at the doors became less frequent. But beneath the surface, something had changed. We all carried a new awareness, a sense that the world was not as safe or predictable as we'd once believed. The administration did their best to restore a sense of normalcy. They organized spirit weeks, pep rallies, and after-school events. Teachers tried to keep things light, joking about pop quizzes and homework assignments. But every so often, a sudden noise or a stranger in the hallway would remind us of what had happened, and the old fear would return, sharp and immediate. I remember one afternoon, months after the last lockdown, when the fire alarm went off unexpectedly during lunch. For a split second, the entire cafeteria froze. Then, as if on cue, everyone sprang into action. Some students ducked under tables. Others rushed for the exits. The teachers shouted for calm, but it took several minutes before anyone realized it was just a drill. Afterward, my friend Tyler and I sat outside on the steps, watching the rain fall on the empty football field. He was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "All the time," I admitted. He nodded, staring out at the gray sky. "I don't think I'll ever forget it." Neither would I. The memories were etched into my mind. The sound of boots in the hallway, the desperate banging on the door, the wild eyes in the basement. They were part of me now, woven into the fabric of my everyday life. In the months that followed, the stories of those lockdowns became a kind of legend at our school. New students would whisper about the substitute who vanished, the The girl in the red hoodie, the shadow in the basement. Some details grew exaggerated with each retelling, but the core of the stories remained the same. The fear, the uncertainty, the sense that anything could happen. Sometimes, I'd catch myself listening to these stories, half believing, half doubting. It was easier to think of them as ghost stories, as things that happened to someone else, somewhere far away. But I knew the truth. I'd lived it. One day, during a free period, I found myself in the library, flipping through an old yearbook. I saw faces I recognized, friends, teachers, even Mrs. Carter, the substitute. I wondered where she was now, if she ever thought about that day. I wondered about the girl in the red hoodie, if she and her sister still talked about what happened. I wondered if the man in the basement had ever been found, or if he was just a figment of my imagination, a shadow conjured by fear. The stories we tell ourselves matter. They help us make sense of the things we can't explain, the things that scare us. They remind us that we're not alone, that others have felt the same fear, the same uncertainty. And sometimes they help us heal. Looking back, I realized that those lockdowns changed me in ways I didn't understand at the time. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that small voice in the back of my mind that told me when something wasn't right. But I also learned about resilience, that the quiet strength that comes from facing your fears and surviving. I saw it in my friends, in my teachers, in myself. We all found ways to cope, to move forward, even when it felt impossible. There were days when the fear felt overwhelming, when I wanted nothing more than to stay home, to avoid the world outside. But each morning, I got up, packed my bag, and went to school. I refused to let fear control my life. Over time, the memories faded, becoming less vivid, less immediate. But they never disappeared completely. They were always there, just beneath the surface, a reminder of what I'd been through, of what we'd all been through together. Even now, years later, there are questions that linger, questions that may never be answered. What would have happened if Mrs. Carter had opened the door? If the girl in the red hoodie had run into the hallway? If I'd made a noise in the basement? Sometimes, I replay those moments in my mind, imagining different outcomes. But the truth is, we did what we had to do. We followed the rules, trusted our teachers, and looked out for each other. In the end, that's all anyone can do. I still think about the man in the basement, about the way his eyes seemed to look right through me. I wonder what brought him there, what he was searching for. I wonder if he ever found it. But most of all, I think about the people who were there with me, the friends who held my hand in the dark, the teachers who tried to keep us calm, the strangers who became part of my story. We shared something that day, something that can't be put into words. Life goes on. The school year ended, and a new one began. Some students graduated, others moved away. The stories of those lockdowns became just another part of our school's history, a cautionary tale for the next generation. But for those of us who lived through it, the memories remain. They shape who we are, how we see the world. They remind us that fear is real, but so is courage. That even in the darkest moments, there is hope. I still walk the halls of that old school sometimes, visiting friends or helping out with tech crew events. The basement doesn't scare me anymore, not the way it used to. I know now that shadows are just shadows, that fear loses its power when you face it head on. And every time I hear the intercom crackle, every time I see a teacher lock the door, I remember those days. I remember the fear, the uncertainty, the relief when it was finally over. And I remind myself that I survived. We all did. If there's one thing I've learned from those experiences, it's that life is unpredictable. You never know what's waiting around the corner, what challenges you'll face. But you also never know how strong you are until you're tested. The world can be a scary place, But it's also full of kindness, of people willing to help, to protect, to stand together in the face of fear. That's what I hold on to, the knowledge that I'm not alone, that none of us are. So if you ever find yourself in a moment of fear, remember this: you're stronger than you think. And sometimes, the scariest stories have the most hopeful endings.